Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, you may blame the problems the government is facing today on its own manifesto from the general election last year. It wasn't a suicide note exactly, more a guide to shooting yourself in the foot. How so? Well, those twin ambitions of running a budget surplus and cutting $12 billion in welfare, so useful at election time and making Labour look weak, have proved awkward in power. The words petard and hoist come to mind. So let's focus a little more on where we now stand on welfare and how far Ian Duncan-Smith got in delivering the government's aims. Here's our policy editor, Chris Cook.
Working age welfare has been cut time and again since 2010. Protests against the cuts to disability benefits, for example, have become a regular occurrence. Yesterday, though, the now resigned Work and Pension Secretary seemed to agree with the placard wavers.
So why is it that George Osborne keeps going back to the welfare budget? Well, he's really got few choices. He's boxed himself in to that position. First of all, he said he'd like to run a budget surplus in 2019. That will require either spending cuts or tax rises to achieve. But he said, however, he doesn't want tax rises. In fact, he's penciled in some tax cuts. Furthermore, there are some budgets he won't touch, for example, pensioner benefits and the NHS. And what that leaves is that he has very few options other than a few unprotected apartments and the working age welfare budget.
George Osborne's always believed that you can cut as much as you like from working age welfare and there's no political price to pay, because even though individual claimants might be hurt by it, overall the electorate don't really mind. The people who vote aren't affected and they just don't care.
Still, it wasn't supposed to be like this. The dream was we could save money on welfare by reforming it, getting people into work and making sure that money is focused on people who need support.
I think we're showing you can come up with some very radical answers. If you take welfare reform, what we are putting forward is the most radical reform of the welfare state since Beveridge for sort of 60 years. I think it would have a transformative effect on making sure that everyone is better off in work and better off working rather than on benefits.
An emblem of this reform was the Work Capability Assessment. Mr Duncan-Smith accelerated existing plans to check whether most incapacity benefit claimants should really be on welfare.
The idea was that this work capability assessment would save money. Here is the DWP's 2011 forecast for what would happen to the incapacity benefits bill after WCA kicked in. You can see it's falling. Here it is in 2012. You can see they expect savings just around the corner. And here's 2013, much the same. Savings to come in the future. But they never arrived. The WCA failed. Here is the OBR's latest forecast for what this bill will look like. You can see it's rising.
The assessments for those benefits are incredibly complicated, and what looks simple in a Whitehall department is just not that simple when you get to people's everyday lives. The complexities of physical and mental health conditions, the complex kind of comorbidities when people have all sorts of different problems affecting them, and the relatively low qualified people doing the assessments just can't cope.
One of Mr Duncan-Smith's other ideas to reform disability benefits and save money was the so-called personal independence payment, PIP. The idea is that it would replace the disability living allowance, a benefit paid to reflect the higher cost of living for disabled people, and save 20%. In practice, though, the replacement of DLA with PIP has only saved 5%.
The planned savings from PIP were always just an entry on a Treasury spreadsheet. There was never a plan to deliver them. They could only be delivered by imposing a much more stringent medical test, and in practice, that just wasn't practical or feasible.
Now, universal credit is a slightly different story. This wasn't a plan to make short-term savings, it was a plan to overhaul the whole welfare system, merging 6 in-work and out-of-work benefits for working-age people. You see, there were supposed to be 5.5 million people on universal credit by this point. So far, there are only 200,000. It's way off track. And in fact, there have been questions about whether the government, without Mr. Duncan Smith to push it through, will keep going with universal credit.
When universal credit was first planned, it was going to be more generous than tax credits. So of course the Treasury didn't mind that much that it got delayed and delayed. Now universal credit will be less generous than tax credits. So there's a strong incentive for the Treasury to push it through.
The Treasury now projects that if it can get universal credit afloat, it can save £2.5 billion a year this Parliament. George Osborne will need that to help hit his surplus target, because in the past few days it became much harder to cut working age welfare any further.
Chris Cook there. Well, I'm joined by the former Cabinet Minister Andrew Mitchell and Charlotte Pickles, who was an expert advisor to Ian Duncan Smith under the coalition government and who's now a senior research director at Reform. Evening both. Charlotte, two objectives: saving money, just getting money out of the welfare budget, and reforming welfare. Do you think they put too much emphasis on saving rather than reforming?
I think that's what ended up happening, yes. So if you look at what Ian Duncan Smith went into government to do, it was very much to deliver a better welfare system that got better outcomes for the people that receive those monies. That tension then with the Treasury wanting to save money, to take billions out of welfare, clearly made that very difficult. And I think the best illustration is universal credit, where the vision is absolutely right, but of course we're seeing that constantly chipped away at because savings are needed.
Right. Do you accept that, John?
Yes, I mean, I accept completely the tension between reforming the system and saving money. And of course, we know we have to save money in tackling the deficit, and welfare is where the money is. But there'll always be a tension between the Treasury and DWP. There was 20 years ago when I was a minister in what was not then DWP, but Social Security. There'll always be that tension, and it's not surprising that tension at a time of austerity is very great indeed.
But are you sure, Charlotte, you're not just blaming the Treasury for the failures of Ian Duncan Smith and you working for him to actually deliver the reforms? Because everything he touched didn't quite go to plan, did it? Universal credits, I mean, it's a fraction of what it should be. The work capability assessment didn't work. The ESA didn't save the money they expected to save. None of it's really worked, has it?
I don't think anyone would say this is a simple task, but I think actually in Ian you have a man who's incredibly principled, who's been incredibly committed to trying to deliver a better welfare system. And I think, you know, if you look at the early indications, the evaluations of universal credit, actually people who are on universal credit are getting into work faster, they're staying in work longer and they're earning more compared to people who are not on universal credit. The WCA, yes, it hasn't worked well. It should be scrapped. We need an entirely different model. But the WCA was designed by Labour, and we picked that up in coalition.
But the things that didn't work, in truth, were not, I don't think, were they not working because the Treasury had tried to save money on? Is it the savings of money that stopped universal credit rolling out, or the work capability assessment failing? No, it was just that they were misconceived.
I think certainly with universal credit, there have obviously been, you know, very well-rehearsed challenges around IT, problems in that.
Can't blame the Treasury.
I think, though, there's still a challenge where you have a different department that is constantly coming back, you know, budget after spending review, after autumn statement, saying, give us more money. You know, the distraction that causes, the focus that you have on trying to say, well, where do we take this out? And, you know, the DWP is trying to deliver an awful lot all at the same time. Right. They clearly make mistakes, but actually that doesn't undermine the fact that they're really important reforms.
Andrew Mitchell, did you see any weight in the IDS argument about pensioner benefits, that the balance between working age and pensioner cuts has been far too heavy on the working age population?
Well, I think it's an issue, but we were very clear in the general election that we would maintain these pensioner benefits, and politicians should stand by the promises that they made.
But you would rather they hadn't made that promise, because obviously that promise is what's...
Well, I think that it's important to look after pensioners because they have much less flexibility in their earning power and in their spending power, and their needs also increase. And many of them, you know, most of them have given this country a great deal in their working life. So I wouldn't say that was at the heart of the problem. But there is always these tension and these big projects, as Charlotte was saying. You know, they're always bedeviled by problems. I think universal credit is a very good change, and we have to persevere with it and get it right.
OK, now, compassionate conservatism. Here's the paradox. Who is the guardian of this? Is it Ian Duncan Smith, who many people think of as on the right of the party, the kind of the more harsh, I suppose you'd say, the ones who want to cut? Or is it George Osborne, who's now being portrayed as the guy who's, if you like, trying to slash the benefit? Who do you think is the guardian of compassionate conservatism?
I am absolutely clear that it is both, and they both have a different role to play. The role of Ian Duncan Smith in compassionate conservatism is to reform the system. He has, after all, got 150,000 disabled people back into work for the first time in each of the last 2 years. And for George Osborne, a one-nation compassionate conservative, certainly, because he's got to make sure that we don't imperil the future of the next generations by the debts that we've run up and the size of the deficit today, which have got to be tackled.
Who do you think is the more compassionate of those two?
I think you can't do compassionate conservatism without an economy that's working, and I think the Prime Minister made that point exactly right today, that you can't have opportunity if the economy's not there, if jobs aren't there, and that's what we've had. We've had an incredible jobs growth that has enabled more people to go into work. So I'm going to sidestep that and sort of recognise there's value in both.
Right. Thank you both very much indeed.